The desert at dusk looked like a wound that never healed. The sky burned with copper and crimson, and the wind moved across the land as if it carried voices of the dead. Somewhere in that dying light, Evelyn Hart sat bound to a horse, her wrists raw against the rope, her breath shallow from smoke. Behind her, her home burned. The small cabin her husband built, the garden she had planted, the dreams she had nursed, all turned to cinders. She didn't cry. Not then. The fire inside her had burned out long before the one that consumed her walls. The only sound was the creak of saddles and the dull rhythm of hooves against dust. Among the riders, one moved apart from the others. His name was Nantan, young, but with eyes that had seen too many winters die. When their gazes met, it was not defiance she saw, nor cruelty. Just the same emptiness she carried within herself. The desert swallowed the sun, and Evelyn's shadow disappeared into its mouth. Somewhere deep in her chest, fear stirred like an old friend returning home. The nights were colder in the Apache camp. The women there moved like ghosts, silent and careful. They watched Evelyn with curiosity and pity, as though she were a fragile bird that had flown into the wrong sky. A woman named Marisol approached her one evening, her hair streaked with gray, her voice low and kind. "You don't fight," she said. "You wait. You listen. That's how you live." She pressed a cracked cup of corn broth into Evelyn's shaking hands and walked away. Evelyn obeyed. She waited. She listened. She learned to grind corn between stones, to weave rough cloth from fibers that tore her fingers, to keep her eyes low when the warriors quarreled. The camp smelled of smoke, sweat, and animal hide. Sometimes, at night, she heard laughter from the men and the quiet sobs of the women. The sound of human sorrow was the same in every tongue. When Nantan passed by, he never spoke. Once, he tossed a blanket beside her when the wind turned bitter. Another time, when she dropped her basket of corn, he stooped, gathered the kernels, and walked away without a word. His gestures were small, almost hidden beneath the weight of everything else, but they carried something she hadn't felt since the raid: mercy. It came in strange forms out here, sometimes wrapped in silence, sometimes in a pair of dark eyes that refused to look away. She began to wonder what the townsfolk would say if she ever returned. They'd whisper that she'd been touched by savages, that she'd been changed. Maybe they'd be right. There were moments she didn't recognize herself either. The way her body moved quietly now, the way her heart learned to listen before it judged. Weeks passed. The sun rose and fell, burning the same endless sky. The desert gave no sense of time, only endurance. Evelyn felt herself dissolving into the land, her pain turning into a kind of stillness. Then came the thunder of guns. The camp burst apart under the sudden violence of soldiers on horseback. Smoke, screams, and the sharp crack of rifles filled the air. Evelyn ran, blind with terror. She stumbled through the chaos, her arms covering her head as fire swallowed the tents. A hand caught her arm. It was Nantan's. He pulled her behind a rock as bullets hissed past. They fled through a canyon, their breath ragged, the world behind them turning to ash. She didn't know whether he was saving her or keeping her prisoner. She only knew she couldn't survive without him. When they stopped, her legs gave way. She fell against a boulder, trembling. Nantan knelt beside her, his hand brushing her arm. Blood seeped through her sleeve. He tore a strip from his shirt, wrapping her wound with surprising tenderness. "War take everything," he said in halting English. "You me same ghosts." The words cracked something open inside her. She looked at him, really looked. His eyes weren't fierce or angry. They were tired as her own. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying sand and sorrow alike. That night, they hid among the red rocks, the stars cold and infinite above. Evelyn lay awake, listening to the distant wails of the dying and the quiet breathing beside her. The line between captive and captor blurred. In that silence, something fragile was born, not love yet, but recognition. When dawn came, the light painted the canyon walls gold. She watched him gather flint, strike a spark, and light a small fire. For the first time, she spoke his name. Nantan. He looked up surprised. She hesitated, then added softly, "Thank you." He gave no reply, but his eyes softened for a moment before he looked away. Days passed as they wandered through the wilderness. They shared the same stale water, the same silence. She began to understand pieces of his world, the reverence with which he touched the earth, the quiet grief in his songs. He carried a small pouch of beads, each one carved by hand. When he held them, his face became distant, as if speaking to ghosts. She realized then that the desert had claimed them both, her through loss, him through duty. And yet, within that emptiness, there was something sacred. Compassion bloomed like a rare flower between them, fragile but real. But peace never lasted long in that country. The army found their trail. One morning, the thunder of hooves rolled over the horizon. Nantan's face turned to stone. "They come," he said simply. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere left to go. They reached the ruins of an old mission, a skeleton of adobe and stone. Its bell lay cracked on the ground, its cross half buried in dust. Nantan turned to her, his expression calm, almost tender. "You go," he said. "Find your people." She shook her head. "No, they'll kill you." He smiled faintly. "Already dead long time." Then he stepped into the open, raising his hands. The soldiers fired before he could speak. The air exploded with sound. Evelyn screamed, crouching behind the altar as bullets tore through the walls. When silence returned, she crawled forward, her hands shaking. Nantan lay beneath the fallen cross, dust rising from his body like smoke. Blood darkened the earth around him. She cradled his head in her lap, whispering words she didn't know she remembered. Half prayer, half apology. His lips moved faintly. "Go live. You still got sun." His hand fell, and the desert took him. Evelyn stayed there until the sun bled out. Then she rose and walked back toward the world she had once belonged to. The town didn't welcome her. Children stared, and mothers pulled them close. The whispers came quickly. "That's her, the Apache's woman." The words struck her harder than hunger ever had. She said nothing. She just walked, straight-backed and silent, through their judgment. She took work as a seamstress, stitching fabric for people who would not meet her eyes. Each night, she sat by her window, watching the horizon turn copper as the day faded. The color reminded her of the canyon walls, of Nantan's eyes, of a mercy the world would never understand. Sometimes in dreams, she heard the wind again, and it sounded like the drums of the Apache camp. She would wake with tears drying on her cheeks, her hands clenched as if still holding his. One evening, months later, a trader came through town. He carried trinkets and beadwork taken from the reservations, tokens from another dying world. Evelyn sifted through them absently until her fingers stopped on a bracelet. Tiny white shells, woven in the shape of a sunrise. Her breath caught. She knew it. She could see him working on it beside the fire, his brow furrowed, his hands sure. She bought it without a word, clutching it tightly until the trader rode away. That night, she lit a single candle and sat alone. She turned the bracelet in her hands, feeling the small ridges, the careful pattern. She slipped it around her wrist and whispered, "Mercy wears many faces. Sometimes, even one the world calls your enemy." The candle burned low, the flame trembling like her heart. Outside, the desert wind moved softly through the streets, brushing against her window like an old friend. She closed her eyes and listened. Years later, people would say she lived a quiet life, that she never remarried, that she walked often beyond town to watch the sunset. They didn't know why she always faced west, or why her lips moved silently as the sky burned itself to sleep. The old narrator's voice, slow, weary, full of memory, drifts through that final image. They say the desert forgets, that its wind buries every story in sand. But I've walked that land, and I know better. The desert remembers. It remembers every tear shed in silence, every kindness offered when the world looked away, every name whispered in forgiveness. The screen fades. Evelyn's figure grows smaller as she walks beyond town, the dying sun painting her silhouette gold. The voice lingers like a prayer, If you ever lose yourself in the wilderness, remember her story. Remember that even the captive can choose grace, and that the heart's freedom is never stolen. It's only waiting to be claimed. And then, just before the light disappears, the bracelet glints once, like the desert itself remembering her name.